Hi, welcome back. My name's Devraj. This is Foundations of Bioenergetics, and this is episode number 3 in this series. And basically what I'm trying to do is simply to transmit out what I've learned about bioenergetics and body-based therapy in general over the years. This one is more of a theory module. It's called Feel Your Body More. And for me personally, these 4 words, each of 4 letters each as it happens, really, they sum up, my approach to body-based therapy these days. It's not a lot of complex psychological stuff. The bottom line is feel your body more. The more that you can feel your body, then the greater the level of your intrinsic psychological health. One of the exciting things about bioenergetics is that it works around the mind, the thinking mind. Pretty much everything in traditional psychology, from Sigmund Freud onwards, is going through the mind. It's being filtered by the mind. If I go to psychoanalysis or counselling, CBT, I'm introspecting on my thought patterns and telling the therapist about them, and they may be, suggesting changes or encouraging me to go into certain feelings. I'm making ties between the person I am now, and particularly the dysfunctions in my life, and perhaps events that happened earlier on in my life. That is traditional psychology. And in truth, when bioenergetics first came out and body-based therapy in general, it was combined with psychotherapy. Wilhelm Reich, one of the early pioneers from the 1920s and 30s, he combined psychoanalysis with body-based work, putting the client on the couch, jabbing them here or whatever, getting them to shout and scream and make noise, that kind of thing, and then talking about the experience with them. Alexander Lowen, very similar, father of bioenergetics. But what I personally find fascinating about bioenergetics and body-based therapy is that you don't have to go through the mind. You can just go straight into the body. And the reason that you can do this is because essentially when any form of trauma or conditioning happens to you, and we'll look a little bit more at what those words mean in a moment, it's stored in the body. Your nervous system essentially shuts down, to a degree, your capacity to feel your body. So you can imagine like being born, coming out of your mama, just the feeling of the body would have been an immense oceanic experience, incredible. And then as you get older, as trauma happens to you, as conditioning happens to you, the nervous system shuts that down. So that maybe you get to be 8 or 9 and, you still got quite a lot of libidinal vitality to you. Your energy can still flow, but it's shut down quite a lot from what it was when you were born. Get into the teenage years, and all these kind of hormonal concerns that come up about who we are and whether we're cool and whether people are attracted to us or whatever, and that shuts down even more. And you get to be like 20, 25. I don't know exactly how you measure these things, but it's probably like your sensation of the body is possibly 80% shut down from when you were a little baby. And of course, remember, none of this is anyone's fault. It's not our fault. It's simply that this is how our nervous system functions to try and protect us. And then because we have these frontal lobes up here, because with an animal, perhaps a primate might just release some of that holding intention, But because our culture is very sophisticated from our frontal lobes, and we have this very tight sense of who we want to be to try and fit in and get our social needs met, this is not corrected in our society. We simply get more and more kind of rigid as we go through life. So the answer is expanding the sensation of the body. Let's look very briefly at trauma and conditioning. These days, trauma is a word that many people are busy with, and they want to change society to make it less traumatic. It's totally understandable. Traumatic stuff can happen to us, Early life trauma can happen to us. Maybe we're traumatized later on. And trauma basically means, something is coming into our experience, too fast, too hard, uninvited, and our nervous system is shutting down our sensation of the body to control it. In Freudian terms, it would be called repression. It's repressing the emotion that's naturally stirred up because it's worried that it's too intense, and it's being repressed back into the body, essentially. Now, trauma can have 2 basic forms. There are 2 fundamental categories. One is like a wound of withdrawal. You expect something to be there. Maybe your DNA even conditions you to expect something to be there, like your mama. You're 6 months old and you reach up, you expect mama to be there. And if for whatever reason she's not there, a wound is stored inside, a sense of lack is stored inside. Essentially, a wound of emotional pain. That's a kind of wound of withdrawal. There's an expectation for something to be there that you need, and it isn't there. A wound of withdrawal relating to emotional pain is stored inside. It might be said to relate more to energetically to the heart center in the middle of the chest. Now, the second category of trauma is called wounds of invasion, and this is kind of the opposite. Instead of expecting something to come to you, you're expecting that your boundaries will be safe, they will be respected and held. And then if someone comes physically through your boundaries, whether it's, actual physical, psychological, sexual abuse, or maybe just someone constantly coming a bit too close to you, this reaction of pushing the person out is triggered strongly. But the problem is that your nervous system, because you're very young, comes in and represses that again. And those kinds of wounds relate to anger, and that's stored more in the belly. Anger is the body's natural defense to any perceived sense of invasion. And with these wounds of invasion, it's not always physical, someone coming into you, someone doing something abusive to you in a physical sense. It may be also just someone not really giving you space to be yourself. Your natural ego starting to develop, someone trying to excessively control how you think. That will also trigger this sense of wanting to push out. And if a person's coming in strong, there'll be a nervous system mediated shutdown. Okay, so that's trauma, two types of trauma. Conditioning is a more subtle and pernicious thing, and it's actually much less talked about, really. Everyone is busy with trauma. Trauma is seen as one of the great evils of life, but really conditioning is far more extensive, And conditioning is essentially what you learn from mostly subtle cues in your environment, from your parents as you grow up, from your friends and society around you, from the hierarchical structures and authority figures and whatever, who you have to be in order to fit in and get social needs met, the kind of person you have to be. And so this is also very, very powerful force, operating on us from when we first start to develop an ego around the age of 2, a sense of self, right up into adulthood in our 20s. We are learning constantly who we have to be to fit in, to be attractive to someone of the opposite gender, to get friendships that we think are good, to get a job or role in society. We have to learn to be a certain kind of person. And the only way that we can achieve this is by shutting off other parts of ourselves. So this results, in energy and emotion being again suppressed back into the body. Now, of course, we are social creatures, and whereas it's relatively straightforward to kind of say trauma is bad, though there are certain caveats in my mind around that, certainly conditioning to some extent is inevitable. If you're going to fit in with society, we have a lot of impulses, we would naturally do all sorts of crazy stuff, and to a degree those need to be curbed. But the problem is that this curbing, this cultural conditioning that we go through can be so extreme that it really leaves us with very little in life. I was brought up, I'm mixed race, but I was brought up in Britain. And cultural conditioning there is pretty strong, Little children should be seen and not heard, It's not really okay to make a lot of sound. It's not really okay to just go a bit crazy and dance. Everything has to be a bit restrained, and you hold a stiff upper lip. For the British culture and the British Empire, that worked very well. But for the individual British people, they more lived this life of what was called quiet desperation or something like that. Whatever culture you come from, you can probably recognise the same. Okay, so that's trauma and conditioning. Now, we said that the basic solution is to feel the body more. But the problem is that there's no switch that we have, and we can't just take a decision one day, say, okay, I've seen the light. 38 years old, I want to feel my body more, give it to me. It won't happen, and that's because over time, both our behaviours and our body become vessels of this trauma and conditioning. They hold it in. We learn to get through the day in a certain way. And in the body that relates to our muscles, our muscle system, and our fascia. Now our fascia, our body fascia, is the interconnecting tissue inside our body that kind of wires bits of us together. It's something that hasn't been studied a great deal in neurology, neuroscience, but people are getting very interested in it these days, which is super cool. And essentially what happens is either the muscles or the fascia become very rigid and stiff. They hold holding patterns, essentially what's usually called, or less talked about, dead zones, where the muscle system or the fascia lose their natural toning. A muscle, for example, is not meant to be super floppy. It's also not meant to be permanently tense. It's meant to be toned in the middle, in between those two states. And when your muscles and your fascia are in this toned state, then you can be emotionally healthy, basically, because you can naturally absorb the things that are happening to you, go on an emotional journey with them without having to avoid, and then come out the other side and respond to the situation appropriately. But because what's happened is that our bodies become armoured or full of dead zones, it's not easy to recapture this childlike state of bliss and this vastly expanded sense of the body. What we have to do is put our body in certain positions, breathe and feel our body, do the work of bioenergetics basically. And also relating to that, breath work, or maybe breath work is not quite the right term, but to consider not only the way that trauma and conditioning is held in most of the body, but also that we tend to shut our breathing down in our early teenage years as a way to kind of suppress our energy, again, to fit in with society. And typically that takes the form of holding at the throat muscles becoming tense, and then using our throat muscles to breathe with instead of our abs and our chest muscles. And also tensing around the diaphragm. It's very, very common for people in pretty much anywhere in the world to have a diaphragm that is essentially locked. It's locked. And that again is keeping energy suppressed. It's allowing our thinking mind to maintain some control. Our thinking mind is like, I want to fit in, I've got to get my needs met. There's all this energy coming up from the body, and the thinking mind, I need to keep this stuff down. Lock at the throat, lock at the diaphragm, and to a slightly different thing, locking around the pelvis as well. Psoas muscles become tense, the body becomes locked. But in terms of breathing, shutting down the throat and shutting down the diaphragm constrains our breathing to the upper part of our chest. So we don't activate as we breathe all the emotional intensity and the energy inside of us. And that helps us to keep, this little persona kind of going that we're pumping out into the world. So aside of doing, bioenergetics like the bow and the arch that we looked at last week, and different postures that we'll look at soon, opening up the throat and the diaphragm especially, whether you use bioenergetic exercises or breathwork exercises to do that, is also very beneficial, because as you start to use your abdomen again to breathe with, as your abdominals become involved in your breathing, your energy will increase. And so what's going to happen is that there's more energy flowing in your body. It's pushing into all the areas where the blocks are, which is uncomfortable, but like that they can start to be released as well. When it comes to feeling the body, there's two kind of approaches that you can take here, just to feel the sensation of the overall body. That's one thing, to expand our sensation of the whole body. But the second interesting thing is that there's certain areas of the body that tend to get, a sensation tends to get pushed out of them earliest. Now, the big one of those is the lower back. Many people, when they get to their teenage years, already they cannot feel their lower back. And this is a shame, because when you can feel your lower back, when it's just present in the background of your daily state of being alive, you feel a natural sense of support. Like, your lower back is kind of there for you. It's like you've got somebody there who's got your back, literally. And so, this is quite relaxing for the mind, because if we don't have a sensation of our lower back, then the mind will come in with a lot more control strategies, which tend to lock up our upper body. So the lower back is one area. Another big area is the belly down here. The belly is from where we mediate anger naturally, where we keep our boundaries safe. And for a lot of people, because there's so much fire and reactivity in there, then they're like, our nervous system learns as we grow up, you need to curb that stuff. So you puff it out with food, or you tense it up with a lot of kind of just unnecessary abdominal tension, and you hold all that fiery reactivity in. But of course there's a lot of energy there, and when it can come out again, it doesn't turn you into a maniac. It just means that it's easier for you to hold natural boundaries. And once again, your mind doesn't have to be so much in control. You feel more secure in many normal day-to-day situations because you know that you don't have to plan so much what might happen and what to do. You've got this energy here inside of you where you can take control and stop something bad happening if that should be necessary. Finally, the heart. The heart is a hugely important area. And by that I mean not just the physical heart in here, but your heart center. This is another area that's shut down, and it's not only the seat of the emotional woundings, the pain that we've experienced in life that's been repressed into there. It's also where a lot of mystical experience can happen from, mystical connections. A dissipating of this hardened sense of me when we wanted to let go and just bathe in kind of being. All these kind of experiences are mediated from the heart center. And what's interesting about the heart center is that although the sensation of the heart opening, like when you suddenly have a deep crying jag, something really, you're hit by grief and you just cry, there's a sensation of like a dam bursting or something opening here in the chest. But when you close the heart, it's usually done from here, the back of the heart center, behind the shoulder blades, through excessive tension held there. So this is another aspect to body-based therapy and to feeling your body more. These 3 specific areas of our body, our soma, are particularly important. Okay, so hopefully that's enough basic theory about how body-based therapy works. Now let's just look briefly at the kind of people it might be good for and the kind of people that it might not be good for. So, for example, if you're not drawn to traditional psychology, it's important to recognise that might be a bit of a block. You might need to talk more about what happened in your childhood. But that aside, you might not have the money to do traditional psychology. It is very expensive, to go to a therapist and do talking or the therapy that they're offering. So that's one reason why you might want to look at body-based therapy. You might have done a lot of psychology, and it kind of did some stuff, but you still have this feeling like it didn't really go deep enough to make me feel good. Maybe perhaps, you're still in your 20s and you want to work on yourself, but the idea of talking all about your mum and dad just feels like a massive drag and stuff, which is natural at that age. The typical clients for psychotherapy are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, which is more a natural phase of life when you're starting to introspect on a lot of stuff. But if you're younger, maybe psychotherapy it's expensive and it just feels like a super drag having this therapist, Maybe you're just interested in activating the kind of pre-verbal, healing capacity of the body, because it does have this capacity. As many people will tell you, and you'll see videos on YouTube, animals often shake to release trauma. They may do other things, making sound as well. And so it's clear that the body of itself, without the kind of interference of the frontal lobes, does have the capacity to heal itself, not just physically, but also emotionally, psychologically. You might just be interested in that field and you think, hey, let's do these exercises and see what happens. Another thing with body-based therapy is it's more direct. You're not going through this middleman up here, creating all these thoughts about who I am and what the world looks like. You're going straight into where the stuff is, straight into the body. And finally, you might also be into kind of deep, mystical, spiritual stuff where, ultimately, the psychological me in my mind, it's just a kind of program running, rather like, I got my phone, I download an app from the iStore or whatever, and just run this app. My psychological self is booted up in the morning with my thinking, but psychology has a tendency just to kind of patch that. It's just patching that. It's not really digging into the deeper substrate from where my personality is actually emerging, which is the kind of Freudian unconscious mind, which is represented in the body. So you might be like, I don't want to do more psychotherapy because it's just patching me. I want to go deeper into the body, because as you start to expand the sense of the body, it also becomes quite spiritual. It becomes mystical. Being born is probably an intensely mystical experience, but because we don't have bits of our brain formed then, we don't remember. But it's probably this oceanic feeling. And as you start to recapture your sense of a body, it does have this kind of sense to it. I'm going on a mystical journey inside myself. So that might be something that just attracts you. Now let's look briefly at why body-based therapy might not be right for you. For a start, it might just be too intense. It might be, and that's not like a pejorative statement about a person in any way. It may be that their nervous system just gets excessively triggered by putting their body in positions and breathing more deeply, and it just spins them out all the time, and it's just not helping. They need to find a more gentle way to get going with this, or to work with more, maybe psychology works better for them. That's absolutely, for a lot of people from, especially quite strongly conditioned backgrounds, that is the simple reality of how it is. It's not suitable for everybody. And it's also the case that, mostly with this kind of therapy, we're working on our own. Maybe there's like I have a chat group that runs on Telegram and stuff where you can share ideas a bit and talk about your experience, share a bit. But like a lot of the time you'll be working on your own and you need discipline. When people message me and they're like, okay, Dev, how can I get going with bioenergetics? I'm more like, okay, just take the bow and arch, learn it properly and do it every day for 3 months. Now the question, do you have the discipline to do that? Do you have the willpower to do that? Because the answer might be that you just don't, and that's okay. You may need something different. You need a certain level of discipline with this work, because if you don't have a therapist or a peer group on your back to kind of keep you going, at some point, when stuff comes up, your nervous system will just kind of kick in and it will be like, well, you don't need to do it today, or look at that therapy over there, it's way better, or let's go and try that thing over there, You'll just find a way out. So you need a certain level of discipline, or you need to put some infrastructure in your life in place. A counsellor you can talk to, a peer group of other people doing this kind of work or doing something where you have to check in daily if you're doing it. You need a certain level of discipline and willpower. Okay, so that's the theoretical component of body-based therapy for today and Foundations of Bioenergetics course. Thank you for tuning in. Next week we'll look at another exercise. And don't forget to check out my website, bioenergetics.org.uk, for exciting books and courses and this kind of thing. Thank you.